Crunching data, that's the key to really understanding how governments work. Digging out unique narratives, then telling the story. And putting a voice to all that data? Well, that's the job of the monthly with Senator Pamela Wallin.
So hello and welcome everyone to the monthly in our continuing series on rebuilding the Canadian economy in the post-COVID era. We're now 18 months plus on. Our guest today is Dr. Jack Mintz, President's Fellow, School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary, and he's come back for a return visit to kind of give us an update on where he thinks we are. As we begin today, let me bring in Greg McDougall, who along with Steve Saunders are Government Analytics. They are your hosts today. So Greg.
Well, thank you, Senator. And thank you, Jack, for coming back. I mean, God only knows 18 months into this, we thought this was going to be a V recovery, or some people did somewhere. Yeah. Your presence here has been really reinforcing the fact that this is something that's far more complex than initially thought. And so it's really great to get your views. So again, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
And we will get his views for sure. Of course, part of me just wants to jump into those new inflation numbers that we have for September, 4.4, hotter than anybody expected. There's port congestion, there's energy crisis, there's all of these things. But I want to start with a story closer to home and the referendum results on equalization in Alberta. The no side saying, look, why bother with this particular vote? It takes 7 provinces with 50% of the population to change anything. It's not going to happen. And the yes side saying, yeah, we need this so that we can put Ottawa's feet to the fire. Where do you come down on all of this?
Well, actually, I do agree that there's a real need to, I think, have a debate about equalization. Not that we don't do equalization. You'll see it in every country around the world. And in fact, yeah. The federal government does a lot of equalizing besides the equalization, formal equalization system. I think people forget that. I do think that the referendum, we'll see what the final result is going to be on October 26th. I know the rural areas are voting very strongly in favor of removing the principle of equalization from the Constitution. Calgary has already shown it's voted 60-40 in favor. Edmonton might be somewhat against. We'll have to see, but I suspect that with a very strong rural vote, that probably the whole referendum will pass, and then that'll lead to the legislature, the Alberta legislature, passing a motion. They needed the referendum for that reason, to start a conversation about equalization.
But I guess that's the question. Does it make any difference? The last time the Ottawa looked at this, they can act unilaterally, and they did. They said, we're extending the existing formula for 5 years. Too bad, so sad. We're moving on.
Well, the federal government, it is their program. I mean, right. It is under their legislation, so they can, in principle, do what they want. However, that's not the way Canada functions very well. Even the equalization process that led to the 1957 formula, which has been the basic approach we've had since then for equalization. We had a different approach prior to that. We've had, that's been very much federal legislation, but it doesn't mean that there isn't very significant discussion amongst the provinces. And I think if it's ignored, that's going to potentially lead to, I think, a good deal of unhappiness where the Alberta government may push on some other parts of the fair deal issues that I think could be even more interesting, I think, than equalization. But I think the country needs a discussion on equalization. The system has not worked very well over the past while. The formula keeps being played around with. Yeah. It really isn't necessarily equalizing as we think it is. It has some bad incentive impacts by discouraging growth by provinces receiving equalization payments. And so maybe we need this kind of discussion. It'll be good for Canada if we did.
I'm not going to spend too long on this, but a lot of people were concerned that Premier Kenney's personal numbers have dropped quite a bit, and that people might punish him by, voting against this. What do you think? Do you think this is a way for him to come back? Is it because the COVID numbers are settling down? He'll have a bit more of a mandate?
We'll have to see. Certainly there may have been some people that voted against the referendum, really in spite, to kind of get at the premier.
Yeah.
But if it passes, actually, that's a positive thing for the premier at this point. What it means in the future, we'll have to see. As we know, politics, a year and a half is a long time for the Alberta election. The economy, by the way, is doing really well. In fact, I just did a presentation yesterday to a group in Alberta, and I went through all the numbers for Alberta, and it's amazing how much better this year is than even 2019, which was a very marginal year. And that, of course, is because of the very high commodity prices that are benefiting Alberta, not just oil and gas, obviously, but even things like forest prices and things like that. So Alberta's really on a bit of a tear right now when it comes to the economy.
So the inflation on one side is a boon for the economy there.
Right.
I want to get to that. The numbers out of September, 4.4. Much hotter than, well, not much, but hotter than what people expected. And it's raised that whole question. You see the reaction of most people saying, oh, this is just, of course, post-COVID, this is going to happen. Or as people come out of COVID, there's going to be more spending, et cetera. It's just a blip. Is it a blip or a trend?
Well, I think, many people keep saying it's transitory, but they don't define how long transitory means. Is it just 1 year, or is it 2 years, or is it 3 years? And we are in a period of supply shortages, but we're also in a period of labor shortages. With over 800,000 vacancies in Canada, which is not quite as much as unemployment is. But a lot of the people who are currently unemployed doesn't mean that they could take up those vacancies, because we now have structural unemployment with significant mismatching of skills between employers, what they want and what employees can offer. And so we're in a period, I think, that's going to take some time to get rid of that structural unemployment. But in the meantime, many businesses are finding they have labor shortages, and that's going to bid up wages. And to the extent that that starts getting embedded in expectations, we could see actually inflation that's going to really pick up, or at least stay relatively high for some time. And at the same time, we also have governments, especially in North America, US government particularly, but Canada, based on the last election, could end up stimulating even more the Canadian economy. And that's going to be inflationary, because you're just creating more demand for whatever supply is out there.
I was reading a piece this week, and in the United States, they're calling it the Great Resignation. A record 4.3 million US workers quit their jobs in August. Now, part of that is vaccine mandates. We see police forces and fire forces, firefighters and healthcare workers walking off. But the other part of it seems to be, and we're seeing it in this country too, people just saying, gee, I've been at home working on Zoom for the last 2 years. This suits me. I want to spend more time here. Don't want to work this way anymore. This is going to be a very fundamental problem.
Well, I think it's going to be there's two different parts to that
Right.
question, and one is not necessarily a fundamental problem, but one is going to be, and I'll get to that in a moment, but it's going to be more of a significant change in the way our society operates, which I think has important implications. But with respect to why is there a labor shortage, there's many reasons that may be playing with it. First of all, on the health side, people are still worried about getting back to work. Maybe the vaccine mandates help, in terms of giving some confidence for people going back.
Yeah.
And so that could be a positive thing in terms of encouraging labor supply. On the other hand, we also know that the vaccine mandates have been resisted by certain people. And we've seen that even in the medical profession, quite interestingly enough. And so that could lead shortages there, which is very sensitive, because right now there are significant nursing shortages right through North America. And so that could be a problem as we move along. And then there are some people, they're going to have to go back to work because they need income. But of course, if they're getting support by governments through transfers, then they're not going to get necessarily back to work that quickly. In fact, many of them, I've heard this from employers, have been told that, don't bother me right now. I think I'll still stay at home.
Yeah.
And so the federal government, I think, is going to have to really, in Canada, decide whether to continue these supports. I know that I think the Canada Recovery Benefit will probably phase out, hopefully, but they also have the Canada the wage supplement, which I think also probably should be phased out, except for maybe targeted at some sectors that are still facing
the hospitality sector, the restaurant business.
Exactly.
They're in dire straits.
So I think we're going to need to have a response in that way. Now, with respect to the other issue, which is people wanting to work at home, I think that's going to be a fundamental change that we're going to start seeing, especially in the large urban centers. For example, in Toronto, people were commuting an hour and a half to get downtown. I think they'll be very happy if they can only go to the office maybe once or twice a week. And that's going to mean less office space is going to be needed downtown. It might even also, we are also seeing this happen in the US probably more than here now, but it's already happening here. People deciding, why should I be living in cramped housing in the downtown area? Why do I move to the suburbs or even further out? And if I can work remotely, even most of the time, that seems like a pretty good deal to me. And so, some of the smaller cities are now starting to see new population coming in as a result. And this has happened big time in the US. In fact, the smaller, medium-sized cities in the United States are getting competitive. They're offering to young people $10,000 to help them with their moving costs to move to their community, like Topeka, Kansas. We haven't seen that happen in Canada yet, but that might be something, for example, people should think about in Calgary to attract people coming to Calgary or Edmonton. And so I think that there are things to think about. But what I think is we are going to be in a fundamental change here, which is going to mean less business travel, less demand for commercial real estate, and some hollowing out of the large urban centers, which is going to have some impact on demand for public transit and all sorts of other items. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means a shift that we're going to have to cope with down the road.
Yeah, it seems that some of the, that they're missing each other, the trends. I mean, while in all major centers, they're putting in bike lanes and doing all this and stalling traffic and all in the name of, protecting the climate, we're then seeing these incentives to get them away from the very systems they're investing money in. It seems contradictory, but maybe they're just caught by the circumstances.
No, I think that is going to be the case.
Yeah, I have just by chance spoken to several employers this week in very different industries, and this concern about working at home and people moving to smaller centers and changes in lifestyles. I don't know what the numbers are on this, but these anecdotal comments were productivity has fallen dramatically. You don't have the same when you're sitting in an office and you're all talking in real time, planning what you're going to do next, more creativity because you're bouncing off each other. And people who are at home on a Zoom meeting may also be feeding the dog or, playing with the kids, and that we're losing a sense of focus on the job, and that is going to take a while to reflect, but it is there.
Well, I think in certain cases, first of all, people have to go into work because it is in person. If you get your hair done or you get your haircut done,
right?
You can't do that remotely. So, and there are jobs that are like that, that people have to be at work, particularly in the goods industries, where you're going to have to be at the factory or whatever. So we have to remember that's going to still continue. But there are going to be parts of the economy where remote work is going to be feasible, and it may not mean completely remote 100% of the time, as we saw during COVID, but it could mean part of the time, especially in large urban centers. On the productivity question, I have actually recently read some material on that, and it's not entirely clear. There are some estimates that actually productivity has gone up. Why? Because people are able to save on time commuting. And I know personally, I'm quite happy to do something like this than to take a whole day to go to, let's say, Ottawa or Montreal
and participate in
for a meeting and things like that, which is a waste of time. And so there are productivity gains that are going to be quite possible. And also, it also depends on what employees want. And I think one of the things that's going to happen to labor markets over the next number of years is they're going to become more competitive. We forget that aging is happening, not just in Canada and the United States, but all over the world, whether you're talking about China, Brazil, Europe, whatever. And so there's going to be this kind of like slow growth in the labor force. Immigration is going to get tougher because labor markets are going to get more competitive. And so that's going to mean that businesses are going to want to be more competitive. And so you have a company like OpenText that announced a year ago that they're going to go completely remote because they feel they can hire the best people around the world that way without having to drag them to move to a particular city. So I think there'll be different responses by different businesses depending on how they interpret what's possible, what's not possible.
When we come back to this question, the energy issue is, we're seeing these shortages around the world. The prices are going up, maybe giving the Russians a little bit of an upper hand. What are we going to do on that file? As you say, the prices for what Alberta and Saskatchewan are selling is going up, but we still have the larger problem of how do we get our energy product to market? And how do we do that in the context of the big discussion about climate change?
Well, there's a couple of elements to that. So let me first respond on one part, and that is what's actually happening to production. If you actually look at oil and gas production today, it's actually higher than the pre-pandemic period in Canada. We're actually exporting more. So it's not just at higher prices, and $80 a barrel is really good right now for the industry. But they're also exporting more. There's more production that's happened, at least for Canada. And that's because of the fact that pipeline capacity is increasing, and now line 3 is in production. And if TMX goes ahead, we're actually going to see more production coming out of Canada, not less, in this decade. So that's something to keep in mind, that we're actually in a very good position from that point of view, from the point of view of how the industry is going to do over this coming decade. High prices with higher production sounds like a pretty good deal in that sense. Now that, of course, leads to the second part of your question, which is climate change policy. And there's a great deal of concern about whether climate change policy could be eroded by these very high prices for energy, which is happening everywhere. And there's a very good piece that came out of the BBC just this morning, based on a report that actually the expectation is going to be more production by the end of this decade of fossil fuels, except for maybe coal, which might be slightly less than today, and in fact, meaning that it's going to be much more difficult to get climate change objectives. And I think this is the fault of governments, frankly. I've been arguing for some time in Canada, in my writings, that the federal government, in its plan to get to, let's say, net zero by 2050, if it's even feasible, and whether that's the right objective, that's another story that people haven't really talked about very much. But let's say it is the right objective, and we need to get to that point. Then we have to understand what's the least cost method of getting there. There's been very little effort to look at what this means, what you're doing to the economy over the period. And it's all, and if we think that right now we can shut down the oil and gas sector and coal around the world, and have that replaced by renewables. Well, so far that has not happened. In fact, it's been the opposite. Fossil fuels have been rising. Renewables has been rising faster, but it's still a relatively small part
Part of the market.
of the whole energy sector. And so we haven't seen displacement of by renewables of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels have not gone down in demand. It's actually gone up in the past 20 years. And so it's a challenge. And so if we really want to accomplish our climate change objectives, we're going to have to think about how do we handle the transition in such a way that it's not going to cause unbearable burdens on the wide population with higher heating costs and higher transportation costs, et cetera, and for businesses facing higher energy costs that could end up, eroding our position. And at the same time, as you mentioned, and this is a point that a number of people have made, is that the Western world could shut down its oil and gas sector and coal right now, but the big beneficiaries are going to be other parts of the world, some of them tyrannies. And so this, and of course, think of China. I mean, they made it very clear they're not going to cut down fossil fuels over the next decade. So as the United States buries itself in high energy prices, China can have a rare and good time over the next decade. And that raises, I think, foreign policy issues that we have to think about. So I think we're in a situation that we have to tread very carefully and very thoughtfully in how we get to net zero by 2050.
Part of the discussion around this too is that governments have kind of overpromised and underdelivered on climate change by the rhetoric. The sky is falling, the sky is falling. Pretty soon, people just go, well, clearly it isn't falling just yet. We've got time to do this, and the transition is not going to be 5 years; it's going to be 25 years. We need that more rational discussion with people, and it's hard for governments who have laid their claim to this, to climate change being their defining issue, to then, in a way, back down to have the more reasonable conversation that you're talking about.
Yes, no, and I think also we need to be more honest about what the prices are going to be, or the costs. Right. And this is my point. Very little has been said. And so what happens is when the public finds out that they're facing higher energy costs and things like that, then they start rejecting the climate change policies, because we haven't been very honest about that. And it may, the other day I was listening to somebody on television in the US saying, well, I would be willing to pay more, but you didn't say how much more. Right. and so if you're, it's one thing if you're going to pay a bit more, but if you're going to pay 4 times more for energy to heat your home, I think that the risk for governments is that it could undermine climate change policies quite a bit by losing political support. And that happened, for example, in Switzerland, which, they love the beautiful mountains, and they're certainly environmentalists in Switzerland. But they opposed a tax on airline tickets for climate change purposes and higher fuel prices. And probably they weren't ready to accept that yet. Mm-hmm. So I think governments are going to have to do a lot better job in saying, what is the cost of all this? And what does it mean? And a new RBC report that came out just today, trying to argue that, we have enough money. Canada's got $2 trillion to pay for climate change over the next 30 years. It's not that much on a yearly basis, 100 billion a year, or whatever 10 billion a year, whatever the number is. But we have to think about that. We're going to have higher healthcare costs. We're going to have a whole bunch of other things.
Yeah, and we're seeing that already. I mean,
right. And so if we're going to keep on saying, hey, none of this is going to cost anything, it's kind of like Biden going around saying that this $3.5 trillion package of spending doesn't cost anything.
It's free.
It's people are not going to be fooled, and so we've got to be much more honest and much more predictive in what we're doing. And I think in the end, what we're going to find is that we're going to need to find technologies that help get the costs down. Otherwise, it's not going to work.
The reaction of the public already to the very point you're making. I mean, we're seeing gas prices at, highs since 2003, whenever, in a decade or two. food prices rising, home heating prices rising. Again, we may need a little bit more honesty on this whole issue of what that is going to mean as well. When the governor of the bank, Tiff Macklin, was in a conversation stateside with the Council on Foreign Relations, he was being teased a little bit by the questioner and saying, these things are all, inflation is transitory. And the governor said, well, yes, we're kind of paid to say that. Joking, but then went on, you've touched on this earlier. So how do we and when will we know whether or not this is transitory? The bank has said they don't want to be raising rates significantly. And in fact, some argue, you were talking about RBC, David McKay, the chief, the CEO, said higher rates may not cure inflation this time around.
Well, we'll have to see about that. It is a supply shock, and as we saw back in the mid '70s, supply shocks are a lot different than demand shocks. As we had in 2008-9, the right cure to deal with the recession was to, try to carry out Keynesian demand policies and try to get people get demand back because of the credit crunch that happened that time. We're in supply shock territory right now, which is a lot different. And so we need to deal with the supply side more than we need to deal with the demand side. And that does mean that interest rates may have a different impact than we would normally think during these situations. But I do think interest rates are going to go up, which isn't so negative as we think. In a growing economy can handle higher interest rates. That's not the end of the world. But I think it's the more difficult situation is the impact of inflation on the economy and what it does to the economy. So let me raise 2 points.
Walk through that. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me raise 2 points about that. One point is that inflation starts hurting people. In fact, even if it's transitory for 2 years or 3 years, people are facing higher price levels today. We have to remember that. Heating costs have gone up and they're not going to go down. Food costs have gone up. It's unlikely that food's going to drop in prices. I mean, it can happen at points, but it's because it is volatile. But we're not necessarily going to see large reductions in price levels. I was looking at the consumer price index since 2000, and even in the 2020 period, there was a couple of months when price index actually declined. But by the end of 2020, it was higher than it was in 2019. But now with people facing, 5%, and let's say if this goes on 2 to 3 years, 10%, there's going to be many low-income people that are going to be, or people on fixed incomes that are going to be very badly hurt by this inflation tax, which is really what it is. And so that's one thing we have to remember. The other thing is that when it comes to capital income, corporate income and interest and things like that, governments tax people on their capital income, which without allowing correction or adjustment for inflation. And so what happens is that people end up paying a lot more, and corporate earnings also get more distorted as well. In fact, they end up getting blown up during inflation periods because companies are carrying their assets at historical prices. And they write off depreciation costs and inventory costs based on historical prices. But when they, at a later time, have to replace those inventories and replace capital, machines and structures and everything else, they have to pay a lot more for them. And we have to remember industrial good price has gone up 15% this past year, not 4.4%, but 15%.
Yeah.
So we're going to be corporate earnings are actually overestimated or inflated right now, and are not necessarily reflective of what inflation adjusted earnings would look like. And the last time we went through this period, which was back in the 1960s and 70s, with relatively, or 70s and 80s with relatively high inflation, there were studies done that showed that corporate earnings were about 25% overstated. Even taking into account adjustments for interest on debt, which tends, again, is a benefit to companies because that debt falls with inflation, the purchasing power, and the lenders are the ones that get hurt, not the borrowers. And so once you take all that into account, we're getting misstatements there. And some people are going to be protected because governments index their transfer payments and things like that, and they'll be okay. But not everybody is in that position. So if inflation ends up being 4 or 5% for several years, that's going to be a real concern.
We just go on a little diversion here for a moment, just on the question you were talking about supply and demand, and we're seeing all these issues. Most of the major ports around the world work 24/7. Of course, in North America, they tend not to. Is that enough to solve the problem, or is this a different kind of supply shortage?
Well, I think, I mean, the shipping side is partly related to the ports. In the United States, I don't, what I've read, but I don't know particularly for Canada, but there seems to be a shortage in truck drivers.
Yeah.
And so that's another part of the supply chain that is not working very well. And then, of course, in Asia, you've had some of the health restrictions come back because the population wasn't vaccinated. And you've had shortages that have been developing in regard to that as well. And so now maybe some of that will be cured by next year. Maybe some of that might be longer term in impact. We'll have to see. But it could take some time to clean up the mess. And as we know with chips, the prediction is that it's going to take at least a couple of years to deal with the computer chip problem. Right. And car companies and others using in electronic goods and everything else are going to be facing shortages because the manufacturing won't be able to keep up as much.
So in your mind right now, with all these conflicting forces coming into play, what's the biggest risk right now?
Well, I think the biggest risk right now is governments kind of living in the past and not moving to a world where there's some new assumptions here. We went through a difficult time with the pandemic. I think the world did a pretty good job actually handling the pandemic in the sense of avoiding major recessions that could have happened. And so, governments pumped up their economies, gave large transfers. And why not? They told people to stay at home, not to work. And so they really, they really should have gotten some compensation for that as well. But it did actually help, I think, get over the pandemic. But now we're in a situation where we never thought inflation would come back. It's back. We never thought that shortages would appear like they did. They are here. And there's a presumption that somehow we're just going to go back to where we were back, in pre-pandemic times. And I'm not convinced that's true. I think that there are some major shifts that have occurred in the economy. Some of them that we talked about, such as the change in the urban settings and potentially some hollowing out of the urban centers. These are things that could be long lasting, and governments are going to have to remember that they've now piled on a lot of debt, including Canada, and we basically now are getting close to exhausting our firepower to deal with future recessions, which could easily happen over this coming decade.
No, I think you've touched on a really important thing, because everybody agreed that people had to stay home and therefore there had to be compensation. But it kind of, even in that short term, became a little way of life. The modern monetary theorists saying that this just doesn't matter. Let's just keep spending and printing money. We're at a point now where the Bank of Canada balance sheet this week, I guess, coming in at 500 billion, 65% of all the money spent on COVID response has gone into the Bank of Canada for the purpose of buying debt, provincial and federal. That's a stunning number.
Yes, it is. And as the Bank of Canada now starts undoing some of this quantitative easing that it's done by buying up government corporate bonds, the federal government is then going to have to rely on other people to buy their bonds. Mm-hmm. And that will cause some pressure on interest rates. And this is when you get a problem if people start perceiving that you're getting into financial difficulty and becoming a credit risk. That will put pressure on interest rates as well. We're not at that point yet, but we can be if we're not being careful in what we're doing. And so I think there's going to be a real challenge, I think, for the federal government now to start rethinking their stance on fiscal policy. It's no more like 2020, we can just shovel out piles of money out the door to bolster the economy. That's not where we're at today. And the worst thing is for the federal government to carry out large deficits as we are projecting in the budget, which will further fan inflation. And so at some point, there's going to have to be some reconciliation that there's just not as much money in the pot. And if we really want to fund a lot of social services in the future that the public would like, either it's going to mean major tax increases, which will hurt the economy, or it's going to mean that the federal government is going to have to find room for some of those expenditures by cutting other ones, and to deal with the deficit that moves closer to balance than we've seen.
But we've just been through an election campaign where there was not a word about that. Interesting, one of our participants today just said, in our discussion earlier about governments being more honest about what's really happening, and the same requirement should be imposed on the media as well to ask these tough questions. There's no indication through that these issues didn't even come up.
No, and none of the parties really were, including the Conservatives, were really willing to discuss it. The Conservatives maybe came a bit closer by saying they balance the budget by 2030, but that's such a long way off that no one really paid attention to it. No, I think maybe Canadians are resigned to deficits are a good thing, and maybe some deficit is acceptable. As we know, economies grow and they can handle deficit to a certain extent. But I think it's a different story where we have now allowed gross debt in Canada to rise to 110% of GDP. It doesn't include unfunded healthcare, unfunded pension plans. And yes, we say net debt is much lower, but we do a really screwy thing with our net debt calculations, because we include the net assets that are in the Canada Pension Plan and the Quebec Pension Plan, but we don't include, outside of the current year, future liabilities. So unless you're assuming governments don't have to pay those future liabilities, it's a bit of a joke to measure net debt where you're subtracting off what are really large amounts of money now. I mean, there's $400 billion in the Quebec pension plan, and over 550 in the Canada pension plan.
Just lift up the phone and hang it up again. That ought to do. And I've just
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, that's great. I just had the world's longest train go past too. So I apologize to those that are listening if they're hearing all these bizarre sounds. I want to come back to, because we just touched on it briefly, what's going on stateside, because of course our economies are so interconnected and so interlinked, and there's no indication that, well, I mean, they may not get these major spending programs through, obviously, in the short term, but the Americans are on a very different track right now. They are, whether the Democrats are captive of their left wing or whatever the issue is, they're headed on a bit of a spending spree as well. What does that mean for us?
Well, that's actually a very good question. And I'm going to be honest, I just started thinking about that. Because I do think, sorry about that.
That's okay. Your
that's
phone
a trouble.
never rings except
your methodology
today.
doesn't work very well. Someone keeps pulling back. Anyway, I should.
That's all right. We'll just try and.
We'll just have to deal with it. Let her ring. Anyway, I think the issue is the following. Suppose that the U.S. undertakes these whopping big stimulus plans.
Yeah.
That are going to bolster demand and even further inflation. At some point, I suspect the Federal Reserve will come in and do something. But let's say the Federal Reserve still takes a relatively passive position on monetary policy. That will cause the U.S. dollar to depreciate. And if at the same time our Bank of Canada, which is much more committed to a inflation target of 2%, raises interest rates, then that will cause the Canadian dollar to rise. Otherwise, we will import U.S. inflation into Canada, and so it's really one or the other. Neither of them are really great circumstances for us. On the other hand, the one positive thing about all this growth in the U.S. is that it does help us on the export side. which is a good thing.
Yeah,
So,
if there's demand.
and so that will help actually improve our economy, but it also means that we will have natural growth coming in without governments having to pump up the economy.
And then the question is, do they resist the temptation to keep pumping up when there's some natural activity happening?
That's right. So, so if there is natural activity, but the thing is that then we have to take a more careful position not to pump up the economy through government spending, while at the same time that could relieve the Bank of Canada to raise interest rates further to combat inflation. So I think that we have to sort of make sure we take a very balanced approach in terms of our own planning.
Senator Marshall was on the line here, and you've taken us to that moment. Now, what else can the Bank of Canada do? What other tools are in their toolbox other than raising rates and funding the debt, funding the spending? Do they have anything else? I mean, we seem to be seeing a merge more of fiscal and monetary policy, and that the bank is acting a little bit more as if it were the finance department.
Well, actually, I'm a little bit concerned about that. I mean, so far the bank has made it very clear that inflation is the target. However, I keep hearing these words like, well, but there's still unemployment, and we don't want to raise interest rates until we sop up on unemployment. But as I said earlier on, I think there's long-term structural unemployment now in the system, and it's going to take a long time really for the economy to readjust in such a way that we can get people who are not going to be able to work because their industries have slowed down to move over to other industries and adopt the skills that are required. And that takes some time. So in the meantime, we could end up with a lot of inflation if the Bank of Canada has this very passive monetary policy. And so I think that's going to be a real challenge. Now, if it is going to do things, certainly it's going to start by reducing its purchasing of corporate and government bonds, and that will help. I think, meaning that that'll end up taking some of the demand away, which will then force up some of the interest rates that governments are going to need in order to, and the corporate sector in order to issue bonds.
And do you think that signal has been strong enough from the bank? Do you think they've indicated that in a real way?
Not yet. In fact, the financial markets seem to be ahead of the Bank of Canada. They're already starting to price in interest rate hikes for 2022, when the Bank of Canada says they're not going to raise interest rates until 2023. So I think the expectation is that inflation is going to come on stronger than people think, and that the bank will have to react sooner than what they've been saying so far.
There was another piece earlier this week from a reporter talking about kind of missed opportunities. The old saying that keeps coming up, never let a good crisis go to waste, that they could have used the pandemic situation and the freedom and that the governments had to act, because the opposition was being exceedingly cooperative on most of the spending plans and all of that would have also been a time to take some action on the productivity issues that we've had longstanding in this country. Maybe build back some of the industries that we let go, like the manufacturers, those people that make vaccines and produce vaccines, that we could have repatriated some businesses that have gone offshore. Would that have been possible? Is it the time, and is it actually important?
Well, I first of all, I'm beginning to really hate that expression that crisis is you shouldn't waste a crisis. And I also really dislike the Build Back Better because it's line, because it's all an interpretation of what we mean by Build Back Better. It actually started with the Japanese after a nuclear disaster, and they said, well, if we're going to build buildings again, let's do it better than what the previous buildings were. And I think that's kind of well understood, and you can understand that. But building back better is, of course, subject to what people's value judgments are. What
I know.
Building back better.
I couldn't agree more.
But I do think that we need to reconsider, I think, first of all, that during that pandemic period, people, were very worried about health issues. They were very focused on short term, and they weren't interested in, I think, in long term type changes at that point, and ones that they don't think they really understood at that point. Nor do I think anyone really understood what would happen after the pandemic, what sort of changes are going to happen in society, et cetera. And the other thing is that people got very worried about their security, health security, obviously, financial security, and everything else. And so when people get worried about the security, they're not actually interested in a lot of big changes. They kind of want to get back to where they were, not get back to some utopian framework that someone might be dreaming up. And so I think the intellectual elites kind of got ahead of themselves, talking about, we should bring in universal basic income, and we should bring in new childcare programs and
pharmacare
and everything else, and we should address inequality, and we should address every problem that existed. Although it's very funny, no one talked about the fact that our investment climate performance was so poor before the pandemic that was one thing that people said we didn't have to build better back with. We were busy talking about other things. But I think that now that we're getting through the pandemic, and hopefully we'll see the end of these issues for after this year, but who knows? But if we can get to a more stable situation, then maybe we can finally address some of the some issues, but it may be through new lenses that we haven't that haven't been there before the pandemic, that we need to now think of today. And that's what I mean. I think the assumptions have changed. The assumptions that we had before the pandemic, I think, are going to be different now than the assumptions that we have in the future. Some things have not changed. Demographic issues, still there. The aging society is still there. The fact that we have climate change issues and the need to deal with emissions, that's still there as well. But I think some of the other things that pile up, debt, inflation, et cetera, I think those things are going to have to be really thought through about how we're going to deal with recovery and making sure that people not only get back to work, but get back to a more secure position.
Before we begin to wrap things up today, just great, wonderful, Jack, thank you. But I want to bring Greg in because I think he's been anxious. I think he might have a question or two. Greg?
Well, thank you very much, Senator. And again, thank you, Dr. Mintz, for showing up. It's been really, really great. And when I started becoming a Mintz follower, a groupie, you were talking and continually talk about gross debt and the liabilities around unfunded pensions and demographics and so on. I guess I'm going to try and put you on the spot a little bit, because we have, you're talking about we're getting the precipice, or there's an area there where we're in the red zone in terms of not being able to cover off future debt liabilities. And so my question is, the debt GDP to debt ratio is hovering around 50%, could be 54, 56. Even now, we'll learn a little bit more of that perhaps next week with the monetary policy report. What is there a number that you would subscribe to that would say, wow, where this has to, the bank, our debt holders are just going to call us? Is it 60%? Is it 65%? Have we already achieved it? Does that, I guess my other point, does the question make sense?
Well, first of all, you're using net debt numbers in those the numbers there, and none of that includes unfunded liabilities. At interest rates as they are low now, I think, and this is quite true. I mean, the financing requirements to deal with debt isn't as large as it was, let's say, during the 1990s when we did reach a debt crunch and almost had to go to the IMF with their caps in hand. Now, at that time, interest rates were much higher. and there was a potential of spiraling out of, in terms of having financial difficulty. And that point, Canada's net debt was about 75% of GDP. Yeah, that's right. And gross debt was over 100% of GDP. We're kind of getting back to the gross debt number. But again, I don't like the net debt number, because Canada Pension Plan and the Quebec Pension Plan are much bigger today and much more important today. And if we just simply net out their assets and not take into account future interest payments that are required there, then and we're talking almost like $1 trillion almost, and that's about almost 40% of GDP. So that's a big number. so I do think that we have to watch it. And of course, if interest rates start rising, which I suspect they will, and in fact, I'm also convinced by arguments made by Charles Goodhart and Pandan in their book that we are moving into a different world where because of the reductions or the labor shortages or the reduction in the labor force, reduction in savings, and increased investment for dealing with higher wages, plus climate change and other things, that we're going to be moving into a world of higher interest rates and real interest rates. Then that debt liability gets to be more meaningful to deal with. And will we get into trouble? Not at this point. And do I know is there a point where we will get into trouble? At some time down the road we can, if the market starts perceiving us as being risky and unable to pay our debt, and we are heavily indebted to foreign non-residents particularly.
On that, just a quick follow-up on that. So the bank says it has it's gone from, 10% to now 45% of all the debt that Canada has. They hold. Then who are the other groups, generally speaking, that would be the other 55% that hold Canada? Are they pension funds?
There's pension funds and non-residents. And the last time I looked at the IMF statistics, Canada's debt held by foreigners was in the 22-25% range, which is pretty large.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you very much. And again, thanks for your presentation today. Just awesome. Thanks a lot.
Jack Mintz, thank you as always for your insights on what is going on in this country economically. And thanks to all of you for joining us for this edition of the monthly Rebuilding the Canadian Economy in the Post-COVID Era. And in deference to Jack, we'll never talk about building back better. We'll just say building back smarter. So thanks again, Jack, and thanks to our hosts today, Government Analytics, Greg McDougall and Steve Saunders. We'll see you again very soon. Thanks.
And that's why Government Analytics takes the time to crunch the numbers, to dig and discover the real story, the data story. Thank you for joining us on The Monthly.